Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Robinson. I apologize for this recording or this intro being just my voice and not a video. That's my plan is to always give you guys a video of me doing a bit of an introduction to the chapter. But I'm not exactly sure what happened to the video that I recorded, so I'm recording it again and just going to do my voice so I can figure out this whole video recording thing so that way I don't have this problem again. Anyway, let's jump into chapter 2, ethical and legal issues of substance use disorder counseling. There are specific ethical and legal issues that are unique to addiction counseling. I've attached an article for you guys to read and to comment on for this chapter for your module assignment. And that article goes into some of these specific issues nicely, and I think it's a good read. It's an easy read, and I think that again it highlights the uniqueness of this field. So just briefly, I'm gonna as I'm talking, I'll sort of I'm gonna go in order of the PowerPoints. And this will just be, like I said, just kind of a brief little intro. So we'll talk about some of those ethical and legal issues. We're going to talk about some credentialing and licensing requirements for addictive use disorder counselors. And then some of the organizations that represent addiction counselors and that license addiction counselors. And then maybe talk a little bit about dual relationships. And I'll touch briefly on the ethical decision-making model, or models rather. But in a nutshell, you're going to use the same ethical decision-making models that you will with any other dilemma that you may encounter in counseling. I think that while there may be some unique or interesting ethical dilemmas or legal issues for addictive use disorders, the process of going through an ethical decision-making process of working through this dilemma is the same, and you're going to use the same ethical decision-making models. Okay, and I apologize. I have somehow developed a little bit of a cold, and so for that. All right, so let's just sort of jump off. Start with is the education and training of addictive use disorder counselors. Or counselors working in with the substance use disorder population. So there's a variety of educational and experience differences that exist in addictive use disorder counselors. Minimally speaking, you can have a high school diploma, be certified or registered depending upon your state and what they title it. But you can be certified or registered as an addiction counselor with a high school diploma or equivalent, specific addictive use disorder training, specific addictive use disorder supervision, and a certain amount of work experience that is monitored and supervised and overseen as you would for your LPC. These folks do this specific to addictive use disorders. And then the next level up would be someone with a bachelor's degree. So you can be certified or registered again, depending upon what your state titles it, as an addiction counselor with a bachelor's degree, addiction specific training, addiction specific supervision, and addiction specific work experience. It's important to note that folks with these two educational levels have to work in an addiction treatment center and cannot be a counselor, an independent counselor. They have to work under another licensed individual. So someone who has a master's degree or higher. And their master's degree, we'll go into that in just a second. So these folks are not able to, hang a shingle and have a private practice and operate independently. They have to work under other people, and they have to work typically in an agency setting. And that's pretty standard across the various states. And then you move into that third level of addiction counselor, and that's the one that has a master's degree or higher in a helping profession. Counseling would be one. Social workers, of course, could get licensed in this field or in this with this level of licensure as well. So you have to have a master's degree or higher, addiction counseling specific training and coursework, addiction specific work, and addiction specific supervision. So exactly the same as the other two levels, except you have a higher level of education. So as I'm talking about this, I hope you're hearing that the difference is that education. The number of hours in training and supervision does differ, but the biggest difference is in the educational level. When you go to get licensed as an addiction counselor, whether it's a license, a certification, or a registration, all of those various levels of credentialing ask whether or not you're in recovery. And if you are in recovery, so if you've struggled with an addictive use disorder, are struggling with an addictive use disorder, you have to be sober and in recovery for typically it's 3 years. Again, that varies state by state. But that's a question that's unique to addiction counseling. In your LPC license process or licensure process, you're going to be asked whether or not you've been convicted of a felony or had DUIs. Those questions can vary, but it's not specific to are you in recovery. Addiction counseling specifically asks that question. So again, the difference is the the educational level. The LCAS that I have and the AADC that I have all indicate that I'm a master's level counselor, addiction counselor. Those with the other levels of education and training would have different letters behind their name. So this is a long, complicated process. This is one of the areas of research that I'm really interested in. My dissertation was actually around licensure, addiction counseling licensure. So I could talk about this for a long time if any of you guys are interested, but I won't for the purposes of this introduction. Going down, or just sort of going through the PowerPoints, there are a couple of different agencies that certify or that credential addiction counselors, whether it's the certification, the registration, or the licensure. NBCC does, International Association of Addictions and Offender Counseling, and then NADAC. Your book mentions NADAC, but they fail to mention IC and RC. IC and RC is the International Certification and Reciprocity Consortium, and 49 of the 50 states actually use this certification process for their licensure, not NADAC, which is kind of interesting. And there's a variety of different licensures that you can get through IC and RC, just as you can get through NADAC. But IC and RC it seems to be the more vocal certification or credentialing agency for addiction counselors. This is what I am credentialed through, and both here in North Carolina and in Louisiana. So IC and RC is something to remember and note and be aware of if you're interested in addiction counseling. Okay, so the ethics. So what's interesting is NADAC has a code of ethics for addiction counselors. But you're counselors, so you're going to follow the ACA code of ethics. So the short story of this, or the short sort of version of this, is I'm a counselor. I'm a trained clinical mental health counselor first, who specializes in addiction. So I follow closely the ACA code of ethics. So whether I'm working with a family or somebody with bipolar disorder, or I'm working with somebody with an addictive use disorder, I'm following ACA code of ethics. So that's sort of my baseline. That's for me, the overarching ethical principles or guide that I'm going to use. Not NADAC's principles, and IC and RC has some guidelines, but I follow ACA code of ethics. So that's the short version of that. If I were only a certified addiction counselor or a registered addiction counselor, I would obviously follow a different set of code of ethics, but because I'm a counselor, I follow ACA code of ethics. You guys are all being trained to be counselors, so it's my recommendation and my encouragement for you to follow ACA code of ethics. We have a whole class on ethics, so I'm not going to go into that too much. Confidentiality and clients' rights, those are going to be the same. Again, you're following ACA code of ethics. Confidentiality with addiction counselors, you have to be a little bit more mindful because you're predominantly going to be using group counseling if you're working in an agency setting. You're predominantly going to utilize that medium or that sort of approach. Traditionally speaking, that's what addiction counselors use in agency settings. That's what insurance companies will pay for, and that's what treatment centers use because you can get to more people in a shorter amount of time. I want you, as I say that, I want you to think about sort of the conundrum or the dilemma that might present for somebody who needs some pretty long-term counseling. And as you're going to hear me say over and over again in this course, individual counseling and individualized treatment is paramount for folks who struggle with addictive use disorders. There's so much trauma and upset and discomfort and discord and so much negative life experiences and interpersonal experiences that need to be worked through. And so it's really difficult to address all of those things in group counseling. So back to the confidentiality, you can only be mindful of your respect and limits to confidentiality. Group members, you can only ask that they be confidential or that they respect everyone's, every group member's story or the information that they share, but you can't guarantee other group members that they're going to be confidential. You have the same limits. If your client tells you that they want to harm themselves, meaning kill themselves, if they want to harm someone else, kill someone else, or there's reasonable suspicion that they have harmed, or there's a potential that they could harm somebody elderly, disabled, or a child, it's mandatory that you break confidentiality. You have a conversation with them about how that's going to happen and what you're going to do, if possible, of course. And that's when these are the limits to your confidentiality. I'm not going to go into the code of code of federal regulations, because that's about client confidentiality, and I know you're going to go into that in ethics, but be familiar with this. This does go a little bit into some limits to confidentiality that you may have to abide by another agency's questioning. So let's say you're working with the nursing board because someone has been mandated to come to you in order to keep their license. So if a nurse, just as an example, if a nurse is mandated to addiction counseling, they may require that you report on their on the nurse that they're monitoring, and of course release of informations are going to have to be signed, but they may ask for a bit more information than what you typically be comfortable giving on a client. I'm not going to go into HIPAA. You're going to go into that in ethics, but essentially, it's making sure that the client knows what they're signing up for, and making sure that you have informed the client of their confidential rights, their client rights, and that they are going to be treated by you and your level of expertise and what you're going to do with their records and how you're going to maintain their records and how you're going to keep their records confidential. Let's see. A couple of ethical dilemmas that might be a little specific to addiction counseling, and I'll go through this really quickly, and then we'll end this bit of intro, and I'll let you get to reading your chapter. But go back to the first thing that I sort of talked about with licensure. So remember I mentioned that when being licensed or credentialed rather in addiction counseling, one of the things that they ask is, are you in recovery?